Hello, and welcome to another episode of Solipsist Watched. I'm your host, the Social Solipsist, and this week I watched 1962's The Tale of Zatoichi. Now, some of you may be familiar with Zatoichi, some of you may not. For those of you not familiar, Zatoichi is one of the most prolific characters in all of modern Japanese cinematic history, I would say. Although relatively unremembered now, between 1962, when this film was made, and 1973, an additional 24 films would be made about this character. Another one was made in 1989, and then there were a number of remakes and spin-offs, and also a TV show that ran for 100 episodes. And I think with the exception of the later post-90s spin-offs and remakes, they were all acted by, the main characters all acted by the same guy. So credit where it's due, that guy has a work ethic. He also directed the final film in 1989, which was like the one standout if from that sort of segment. But I digress. Anyway, so Zatoichi became rather prolific over a course of 10-ish years. And is remembered to this day by some folks, including some modern filmmakers. In particular, Beat Takeshi made a remake in 2000, or not a remake, but a modernization in 2003. There was also an American film called Blind Fury, I think. I've never seen it, but was basically a Zatoichi film, just, blatantly stolen, or the core concept is. Anyway, so Zatoichi, contrary to what you might expect, and Zatoichi is known as quote-unquote the blind swordsman, Zatoichi is not what he appears to be on the surface. As far as my own personal experience with any of the Zatoichi films before, I can't actually remember if I've ever seen any of them before. If I have, it was 15 years ago or more, and I don't remember it well enough. I am 99% sure I've never seen this film. I certainly don't remember it. But it is a fascinating film for a variety of reasons, not the least of which is, especially for 1962, it's sort of it holds a unique cinematic place. While there is certainly, we could spend all day talking about the evolution of Japanese cinema in the early post-war era. And obviously I've talked about some of that before, in particular paying attention to Seven Samurai and what was the name of the film I actually watched? I don't remember. Anyway, you guys probably remember, or you don't. It doesn't matter. Go back in the playlist and look. The Western one. Anyway, there's a lot of differences in Zatoichi as a structure. Now, there's a lot of sort of interesting history that I don't want to spend a lot of time delving into about Japanese cinematic trends, especially in the early post-war era. But a sort of revival and also deconstruction of the sort of Bushido, the idea of Bushido, and the ways in which it was critiqued by cinema are particularly fascinating because of what was essentially a social critique, because it was basically a social critique of the imperial era of Japan in some ways, where the ideas of Bushido had been stretched out long past sort of basically these ideas of the Sengoku period being translated further and further into the future, where they were further and further corrupted and used by people in power to adapt to their needs. Zatoichi is set in the Edo period, which is after the sort of early 1600s, post-warring states, and sort of in this era when Japan was undergoing sort of social and political upheaval, where there was less of a really strong, centralized imperial social and cultural governance, and there was more evolution and more decentralized control, that not necessarily in a positive way, but the evolution of and the expansion of the groups that would become the Yakuza, who exist to this day as organized crime in Japan and beyond. So the Yakuza are interesting because they have origins back in the Edo period, basically when this film is set. Contrary to a lot of films, both pre-war and post-war, Zatoichi is not the character you expect him to be. Usually when you talk about, especially in cinema, Japanese swordsmen, it's usually a fairly sort of typical archetype of a heroic character, one who has fights for good and honor and all these other things. That's not universally true, but commonly that's still a thing even in the post-war period. Zatoichi, by comparison, is very, very clearly framed as not only is he a Yakuza, but he is a character of fascinatingly gray area, where despite how compelling he can be, you're repeatedly reminded that he is working not only within the context of, but for Yakuza gangs, basically people who are explicitly, abusing and exploiting the people around them, largely in small towns. Most of the Yakuza in the early era really sort of fell into two camps of basically either they ran illegal gambling dens or they were hustling like low quality merchandise. That was basically it. The former being much more visible in sort of the cinematic canon. And so that is sort of right off the bat what is so interesting to me and somewhat different from a lot of other sort of Edo period Japanese set movies, because he is so explicitly not really the good guy. Likewise, so he's not a samurai. He's not even a ronin. He's a sort of a wandering, he reiterates, he's a wandering masseuse. He's a guy who's looked down upon for a number of different reasons. Not the least of which is he's very openly blind and not, hiding it and not trying to hide in the shadows. But he uses that to his advantage in some cases. Now, there's not that much to talk about in the film in terms of the story and, what the plot is and what the, major beats are, because it's not that complex a film. What is most interesting about it to me is what the actor who plays Zatoichi is able to sort of put across with relatively subtle acting, but also just sort of the time and patience that's given in this film. I keep sort of thinking in a grander scale because I can't divorce this entirely from the 26 other, or 25 other films. That sort of, it's given time to breathe and evolve, and you're not always following Zatoichi. He himself is, it's almost as important not to follow him, to just to understand the context in which he exists. You know, it's not, you can't follow a guy with this character around because it wouldn't be that interesting. So much of what makes him compelling is the juxtaposition between him and other people who may not share his beliefs or thoughts or drives, or may not have as nuanced a view of the world as he does. And that's not to say that he necessarily articulates some great wisdom or anything like that. On the contrary, he's a relatively simple man with rather unclear reasons for doing things. In fact, any time you sort of think you have a good handle on who exactly he is or what his motivations are, it's not that those things are subverted so much as they just sort of disappear, which is what I kind of find most interesting about him, is this continual ability to maintain this enigmatic nature. You can certainly get a sort of a box to put him in terms of what does he believe in, you know, money or goodness or whatever these things, and you can get his takes on individual aspects. But as far as piecing together a whole, I think that's what makes for a compelling character, is a character who you learn new information about, and rather than that buttoning them up into like an archetype, or even just not necessarily an archetype, but just a firm idea of a character, learning new information about them expands your understanding and raises potentially more questions. Where trying to know exactly what they're going to do, you may have a better sense of them, but you never feel like you get the full depth of them. And I think that's very compelling because it's not neat. So much of storytelling, especially in cinema and especially these days, ends up being about characters who, by the end of the film, you sort of get this holistic view, or apparently this holistic view of a character and everything that they believe in. And to me, that does not make for interesting characters. A character I know everything about is not a character I enjoy watching, because I can already tell you what they're going to do. Zatoichi, by comparison, has an element, this enigmatic nature that he maintains, continues to make you wonder what's going to happen. Not in a I'm confused or I don't know, or maybe he'll turn this all on its head kind of way, but in a I think I know this guy, but I'm still, there's still an element of surprise that's coming in the next scene. There will always be that element of surprise. Whether or not that gets maintained throughout the series, I don't know. I sort of doubt it. You can't, it's just not possible to make, I don't think it's possible to make 26 films and not rehash a lot of the same shit. And what I've heard is that that's sort of how it goes, is that there's variations, but a lot of the other films are like, oh yes, and it will go the same way. No big surprise there, but obviously there's something compelling about the character. And ultimately, where much of the film is him sort of not taking a really strong stance on anything, there are moments where he sort of makes a firm decision, and the whole movie seems to sort of pivot around him at that moment. And I really appreciate that. Not only because it helps you sort of reorient to his point of view, but because of the way so much of the film is framed, both literally on the screen and narratively, you understand him as you understand him through the context in which he exists. The film does not stare directly at Zatoichi the whole time. As I said before, we go and see other people, and so when there are moments in the film that feel like in a typical, for want of a better phrase, Hollywood structure, it would be, okay, we're tied in on the main character and that's who we care about and everybody else can go fuck themselves. That is not what happens. The camera and the story and the narrative and every aspect of the film never lose track of the other people around and the society that he's affecting. As Zatoichi moves through the world, the world sort of ripples around him, and the film pays attention to those things, and that really adds a huge amount of depth to a relatively simple story. So to talk about the story and the plot for a minute, well, I say that, but I kind of can't. There's not a lot here. So much of the film is, it's some very straightforward plot beats. The stakes are set basically at the beginning of the film. You know how it's going to resolve, more or less. But watching the evolution of characters and how they relate to Zatoichi's presence is what's really compelling about it. It's a bit of an ensemble cast in terms of various characters, minor characters who barely have their face on screen, and larger ones, bosses, thugs, named characters, unnamed characters, all these other things. And even some minor characters you only see twice, but seemingly end up being very meaningful and sort of pivotal to how the story evolves, whether they like it or not. It's really fascinating how this movie unfolds from such a sort of tight and uncomplicated package into something that has so much depth to it. Obviously, I can't speak so much to a lot of the specific aspects about like the dialogue and the script and the acting because I don't speak Japanese, and I can say that it works for me, but I don't know if it works natively. And there are also some, like, I think as I may have talked about before, I don't know. Well, I don't know. There are substantial differences in non-US, non-English speaking films and cinematic stylings that make acting methods and all these other things come off very differently. For me, it all works super well. A lot of Asian cinematic stylings comes from a more of a theater-based, very played to the audience sort of style that has then evolved into cinema. At least, well, in some cinematic cases, modern Asian cinema is largely aping Hollywood. We don't need to delve into all that right now. So I think this all works really well. I appreciated all the performances. I think all of the styling works really well. As far as the actual like production values and things like that, there are certainly aspects of this film that look cheap. I don't know how much this was made for. I have to imagine it was not very much. Under the circumstances, I think they do an admirable job with what they probably had at their disposal. The scope is very limited, given the story, so they don't have to make, huge impressive sets. The costumes are very traditional, and they look good on screen. But that is going to get to something I do want to talk about, which is some of the cinematography. And this is less about sort of traditional, talking about traditional ideas of big air quotes and uppercase letters cinematography in terms of framing and all these other things, but more about the thing, something I really like, which is the use of light and shadow. This film is in black and white, and even more so than a lot of higher budget Japanese films in black and white that I've seen from this period and beyond, this film really goes hard on using light to tell a story. I think some of that is very deliberate by virtue of trying to do some storytelling through the ideas of light and darkness and how they do and don't affect Zatoichi with him being blind. Some of them are direct, some of them are indirect, just with like not something that that the characters talk about, but that is acknowledged within the cinematic space. And then there's the artistic aspect as well, where there's some really nice use of, I have to imagine, some of it is set lighting, some of it is like using reflectors and things like that to light characters or spaces in unique or odd ways to sort of highlight them in ways that are very, very pronounced. Also the same to cast shadow or to juxtapose light and dark areas in like nighttime scenes and things like that, to give you sort of it's not like, this isn't the prettiest film by any means, and it's not the most directorially competent either, but there's a lot to really appreciate here. There's one shot in particular. There's a few shots in the film that are actually very cinematically nice and interesting. At the very least interesting, even if some of them are a little bit rough. A couple of camera moves, especially towards the end of the film, that may be particularly noticeable to others. I don't want to shout out what they are, but I will say there is one shot that moves from interior to exterior without any cuts, and I really love that shot. It is done super, super well, and if you watch this film and pick it out, I think you hopefully may appreciate it as well. Yeah, so I just really appreciated that. I don't know that I have that much else to say about this film. I have been at this for 20 minutes, I guess. I really like this. It's not, it's not like a great film. I can't say that like, oh, it's, got great story or great cinematography or great acting or like any other part of it, but it is so much better than the sum of its parts. And I think I'm going to have to go back and watch it again. There's so many little things that I really appreciated that I did notice that I have to imagine that there's a bunch I didn't as well. And yeah, I really enjoyed watching this film far more than like the individual components would suggest I should have enjoyed it. So yeah. Anyway, thank you guys for watching another episode of Solipsist Watched. I've been the Social Solipsist. I will see you guys next time.